I'm delighted, very honored, humbled, excited, and definitely going to relish introducing our speaker, Robert W. McChesney, who's the Gutzel Endowed Research Professor in the Department of Communication at the University of Illinois, Urbana-Champaign, USA. Bob McChesney began his working life as a journalist, and that's a pretty good start point for the discussions we have today, so he knows what he's talking about as a coal-face worker. He was a sports writer. He also, and this turns into one of my own obsessions, founded The Rocket, a rock magazine about the development of rock music in Seattle in his early days. Since 2002, in the midst of his other working activities, he's hosted a show called Media Matters, which is broadcast every week on Sundays. Program guests have included such figures as Noam Chomsky, Seymour Hersh, and a particular favorite of mine, Gore Vidal, and we must have a chat about that. That must have been an occasion. The program is very successful, not only editorially, but in terms of its editorial reach. Will you please welcome Professor Robert W. McChesney?
Thanks, Bob. Thank you all for coming. It's an honor for me to have an audience like this morning. I want to thank Annie Franklin, also known as Reese Jones, and I want to thank Justin Lewis and everyone connected to the program here at Cardiff University for hosting this phenomenal event, bringing us all together, and judging from talking to folks here, putting together an extraordinary program in journalism studies at this university that we don't really have anything quite like it in the United States, I regret to say. I take no pride in saying. One of the things I have the privilege of having take place in my career at this stage is I get invited to a lot of things to give talks, especially overseas, and I never accept them as a rule. And I don't because I don't like to travel or anything, but my schedule is such with my family. I commute to work. I live in Madison and I teach in Illinois, so 15 weeks a year. I teach one semester a year. I have to do a 15-week, 3-day trip each week. So that sort of eats up my entire travel allotment for the year. I don't have the option of traveling otherwise. And I do travel a few times. So that's basically, so I don't come to Europe at all, except my wife, who's Norwegian. We go to Norway every second year to visit her family for about as long as she can stand them. So it's usually about 2 days. Oops, this is being recorded. Can we delete?
Yeah.
Can we delete?
We'll send her the link, Bob.
Yeah, thanks. No, I'm not worried about her. It's her family.
Oh, it's the folks.
But the reason I'm here is Bob Franklin is entirely due to what you've set out to do here with your colleagues, with these two journals, with this conference. If I stand for what I write about and believe in, I have to support this conference and I have to support these journals. This is really, I think, where the cutting edge is of studying journalism in the world today, in the English language at least. I can't speak for other languages, but in the English language, this is it. And this is a very important group of scholars here. This is really, I think, the cutting edge of people considering the most important issues about the future of journalism. And I don't think I need to convince anyone in this room that therefore we're talking about the future of self-government and, dare I say it, civilization. So on that note, let me get started. I enjoyed the talk yesterday, very much by Emily Best. I've been a big fan of her work at The Guardian. The Guardian is one of the newspaper websites, in fact, that Americans widely read. Our journalism is so atrocious in the coverage of foreign affairs that if anything ever happens in Europe, most Americans very quickly go to the Guardian website to find out what it is, because we will never find out in our news media what's taking place, and not just in Europe, but in other places as well. At the same time, I have somewhat of a different view of the state of affairs in the United States than she had, and I think I want to take this talk to sort of present my take on what's happening there. One thing I will add about The Guardian, because it is so striking, and I was talking to some people last night about this, and if you take The Guardian, which is a nonprofit institution and would not exist otherwise, the Scott family hadn't made it a nonprofit institution in the 1930s, it would have gone the way of Murdoch or some other slime ball long ago, and we'd all be bemoaning the glory days of the Manchester Guardian. So if you take away The Guardian and publicly funded nonprofit media in this country, based on what I've sampled in the last 24 hours, there ain't a whole lot left. There's some, but I mean, you're getting pretty close down to the slab where we are in America, where it's really not an overwhelmingly impressive amount of journalism. And so that's worth noting, because there are important lessons there for those of us who are concerned about having journalism. I think extremely important lessons. I share her enthusiasm about the various young kids who are working for free and trying to scramble money to start websites. I share her enthusiasm about the one or two capitalists she tracked down who apparently have an interest in journalism. Hopefully she didn't have to hunt too long to find them. And I know there's some phenomenal stuff being done and some great experiments. But as you're about to hear, I think that is not going to be sufficient to the task at hand. And I think that's, in fact, historically and theoretically improbable and contradictory, in fact. But my work, my work from the group Free Press that I helped start, which is all about trying to get more informed participation in media policymaking, we are going to work closely with her and all people like her. We work with all these groups. We desperately want to have funding for these groups. And we think, if you'll hear, that if you don't have institutions and resources going to journalism, you don't have journalism. You have something else. I don't know what it is, but it's not journalism. And if you need journalism for a free society, then you're in the situation we're in right now in the United States and increasingly around the world. I also know, to conclude the introduction, what Bob said yesterday, that our country, and I suspect looking around here, this country and the world is filled with young people who want to be journalists, who want to be great journalists. And to me, the mission for us is to give them the opportunity to do that, to create the institutions and resources so we can have great, independent, critical journalism. There's no lack of talent, there's no lack of enthusiasm, what there is a tremendous lack of resources and institutions to make it possible. And as you're going to see, these are very solvable problems. And this is where I will take some disagreement with Emily's perspective yesterday in the United States. The record is that these are not difficult problems, they're solvable. They're political problems, though, and that's the political fight we face to have it. The one thing I will also conclude on this point before I get started is that the labor market for young people for journalism in the United States is the worst it's ever been in American history. If someone had a college degree in 1932 at the University of Illinois and marched out the door to get a job when the unemployment rate in the country was 26%, they would have a better chance of getting a decent paying job as a working journalist than they can today. And it's not going to get any better unless we make some changes. There's nothing on the horizon to suggest it's going to get better. In fact, this is going to sound astounding. This could look like a golden age 10 years from now. People say, man, remember how great it was back in 2011? You could actually make $8 an hour. Woohoo! Really, man? Cool. That's unfortunately the direction we're on. There are three basic points I want to make today, and that I just want to leave you with. And I do this with a certain amount of hesitancy. Initially, I was going to come to you as sort of an emissary from a strange land called the United States, try to tell you about our odd practices there. And then I discovered there were a lot of Americans here and then there were also a lot of people like Emily making assumptions and statements about America. So I thought I'd better come as one who's spent his whole life in that land and studying that land and tell you sort of my take on it and I think the points I'd like to leave you with. First one is that professional journalism in the United States, even at its best, even in its glory days of the 1960s and 1970s, had deep flaws. And the flaws have grown more pronounced with the tremendous commercial pressure upon journalism over the past generation. The flaws have grown more pronounced. This doesn't mean there aren't great journalists and there's not great work being done, past and present. We know all about that, and it's very impressive, and it's all the more impressive in the context in which it's done. So my respect level for the Seymour Hirsches, for the great journalists who've worked through the system is that much higher, knowing that what they do oftentimes is not encouraged by the system as a result of their actively working against the logic and nature of the system. But my argument is going to be that the professional system, we can't romanticize that and say, all we have to do is go back to that, get back to 1995 and everything's swell again. The only problem is that salaries have come down, there aren't as many jobs. Part of the reason we're in the crisis today is because the professional system is so flawed, it made it a lot easier for the system to collapse as it's done in the United States. It did not do a very good job of creating a new generation of media users, journalists, consumers. In professional journalism, I think we have to understand, and most Americans are unaware of this, it was not actually mandated in the American Constitution. It's a relatively recent development. It came in the beginning of the 20th century, roughly 100 years ago. And the point of it, among other things, but primarily, it was actively promoted by the leading and most intelligent newspaper publishers, the Pulitzers of the world, protect monopoly power in their local markets. To protect the fact that they had monopoly power, making great profits in city after city. And by monopoly, sometimes a monopoly has 2 or 3 companies. But as economists know, they operate in terms of pricing and output like monopolies, not like competitive industries. And that this was highly controversial during the progressive era in the United States. It led to tremendous upheaval and debate over the quality of journalism, much greater than anything we've seen subsequently. And the solution was the notion of professional journalism. That editorial content of these newspapers, which were the dominant news media at the time, would be separated from the owner and the advertisers, that there would be a Chinese wall, as they put it, separation of church and state, and you could trust the content of the news because it would be the responsibility of trained professionals, trained in journalism schools, none of which existed before 1900, all the major ones existed by 1925. It was this crucial period that created the idea of nonpartisan, neutral journalism that would serve the public interest. And it didn't matter who owned it because they had no control over the content. Don't look behind that mirror at the owners and advertisers. They are irrelevant. The pros trained in journalism schools are going to run it fine. It doesn't matter if it's only one newsroom in a town, because if you have trained professionals, you have 10 newsrooms, they'll all do the same thing because they're trained professionals. They'll go to the same sources, they'll cover it the same way, because that's how objective news works. That's the background of professional journalism. Now, it has certain merits to it. The quest for factual accuracy, an evidentiary basis, was a distinct improvement over what it immediately replaced. The sensationalism, the lack of commitment to factual accuracy in too many newspapers and too many journalism. But it had some deep, deep flaws as it evolved in the United States that still exist with us today, in fact, are worse than ever. The first flaw is that professional journalism, the way it evolved in the United States, came to rely upon people in power, or what are called official sources, to set up the range of legitimate debate in our news media. What a legitimate story would be was by what they were debating, what they were talking about. And this was very important, because what it means is that if a journalist raises an issue that's not being countenanced by those in power, they're considered unprofessional. They're considered ideological. And that's a tremendous disciplinary effect to get journalists back inside the range of legitimate debate. We see this in 2 crucial areas in American politics today, and it's been this way for some time, in the first case since the beginning. First, the coverage of U.S. foreign policy and all our various wars and military adventures around the world. War and militarism in the United States tends to be covered very narrowly in a range that the debate is set by those at the top of both our political parties. And dissident views are almost never to be heard. And it's almost an iron law in U.S. journalism that the more certainty you hear about some U.S. action in the world as we're about to go to war, the more likely it's complete bullshit. I mean, it's almost an iron law. Going to virtually every invasion we've had, I think you can go back and look at the actual explanation for it, and it's always lies. Vietnam, Gulf War, Iraq invasion. It never squares up to the historical record. The more certainty there is, that means the more people in power are pushing it. Our journalism in moments like that tends to be propaganda. There's no other word for it. War propaganda on the most important issue of government. And interestingly, ironically, and tragically, the most important issue for journalism in a free society like the United States. The irony is especially astounding when you consider that the person who's considered the father of professional journalism in the United States, Walter Lippmann, whose work is invoked as this is the guy who understood we had to have, trained journalists who told us the truth. Walter Lippmann, in his 2 great essays, which unfortunately are not read enough, Liberty in the News and the work he did with Charles Merce on the coverage of the Russian Revolution and New Republic, in 1919, 1920, when he laid out the case for professional journalism, said the reason you need professional journalism is because governments will lie to you, always. People in power will lie to you, always. Public relations and spin will always try to shape the news and do so successfully, driven by powerful forces. And we need professional journalists to protect us from that. Their job is actually to stop it and say this is BS. And he said it was foreign policy in particular that this was most important because that's where people depended upon press the most. So ironically, the father, so to speak, of professional journalism What he said professional journalism had to deliver the goods on first and foremost is the one thing it's flunked first and foremost. It gets an F, even on a curve. It's blown it completely on that issue. It's even deeper than that, though. It goes back to the founding of the Republic. James Madison, the fourth president of the United States, and one of our great framers, I'm sure you've heard his name. I live in a city named after him. And he's a person, whatever one might think of him, and I've been critical of him in certain areas, like issues of suffrage and obviously issues of slavery. But he was also a profound thinker on issues of freedom of the press and governance. I mean, he wrote the Constitution, much of it. And he spent more time than anyone, except possibly Jefferson, talking about why you needed a free press, why a free press system, why having a fourth estate was mandatory for the governing system to succeed and for democracy to succeed. And Madison's defense and argument for why you needed a free press rested primarily on one issue. Madison, like most of our framers, is a classical scholar, and he studied Athens and Rome, and he said the downfall of both Athens and Rome from democratic and republican status was because they became military empires. And when they did, eventually you have corruption, you have secrecy, you have inequality, and self-government, a republican democratic system can't survive militarism. It's just the two cannot survive permanently. And he wrote at length about this. And Madison was a smart enough guy to say, the United States, you know, we've only got the fringe of the Atlantic seaboard now, but we're already bigger than most European countries. And we're looking at this continent that's like this massive gold mine. You know, it's not going to be very long till we're going to be big cheese in this world. You know, we're not looking 200 years down the road. We're talking a couple generations down the road. And he understood from Greece and Rome, no matter how well-intended leaders are in a democratic society, when you get to be a big cheese as a country, there's strong temptations to flex your muscles and spread it out a little bit. And he understood, and he wrote at length, that if this happens, it will be the end of freedom and democracy in America. And that's why our Constitution has extraordinarily strong provisions to prevent militarism. We can't have a standing army. We have to have Congress-approved wars. The budgets for wars have to be carefully voted on. All these things we have paid no attention to for the last century are actually in the Constitution, thanks to James Madison. And he said the reason we need a free press is that the people of the country, the only way they can stop leaders from going into these crazy wars and invading countries and having a permanent military and setting up a militaristic regime is to have a press system that lets people know about it so they can stop it. Otherwise, there's no stop. That's why we need a free press system. So this is not just an issue of professional journalism. This goes to really the bone marrow, the DNA of the notion of journalism in a free society. And in fact, in the United States, probably the two most eloquent defenses of freedom of the press that have been written by the Supreme Court were written in 1971 in what's called the Pentagon Papers case. And the two opinions by Hugo Black and Potter Stewart both make the case that the whole reason we need a free press in particular is we have to have an independent press system that monitors the government in areas of foreign policy and militarism, because there the people depend entirely on the news media for any sense of the world. They don't have personal experience. People can't hop on a plane and go to Vietnam or Iraq and sort of check it out for themselves. You know, it's not like unemployment or Social Security where you live it. You depend upon news media. And that's exactly why the news media has to be the forward army monitoring governments with this rigorous scrutiny. We've had just the opposite. The other great area and the great flaw of professional journalism has been in economic coverage, particularly over the past generation in the United States as commercial pressures have shifted the news dramatically. One of the great developments in American journalism, and I wouldn't be surprised if it's true here in Britain, is a huge increase in what's called business news, such that some newspapers have two business sections now at times. It's massive coverage of the affairs of business. Regrettably, most of this journalism is utterly pathetic. It spews out spin, it repeats press releases, it extols heroic CEOs as they make their massive salaries and conquer the world. It praises trade deals and tax breaks, and in effect it lets the top 1% of society determine the range and nature of debates over the economy. They control the economy, they discover, they determine how much we get to talk about it. With all the resources that have gone to business news and business journalism, the growth of it in the past 2 decades, the most striking thing about it is how it has missed entirely, completely, 100%ly, the great economic scandals, bubbles, and crises of the last 15 years. It'd be sort of like if you had the entire sporting press of Britain miss the fact there was a World Cup. I mean, it's just like, hey, dudes, where were you? I mean, how do you blow the housing bubble, the tech bubble, the mortgage scams, everything, until after it's happened, when you've got this army of reporters extolling some genius CEO at Enron because he makes $5 billion in a year? How do you do that? It's a crisis of our journalism. Labor reporting was once staple in the United States. In the mid-1950s, every newspaper had a labor reporter and editor. There were hundreds of them, maybe even thousands. Standard position, far more than business reporters. Because it's either more people that worked than there were who invested. Made sense for popular journalism. That job doesn't exist anymore in America. It's basically dead. I don't think there's a single paid labor reporter left in the country. There's been under 10 for the last 15 years. Just doesn't exist. Just doesn't exist. Our economic coverage is basically from the top 1%. They set the terms, they set the debate, and we get the results. The United States has seen a growth in inequality in the past generation that is now well chronicled in books like Hackers and Pearson's legendary new book, or highly regarded, award-winning new book, Winner-Take-All Politics, that is simply unprecedented in history. I think as one economist put it, we've never seen such a sharp decline in living standards by a section of the population of the country unless it was in all-out war. It's the only other times historically that you've seen the living standards of the bottom half of the population plummet relative to the top. You have to be in all-out, war where the survival of the country is at stake. So huge has been the growth of inequality. And this is not an issue in our news media. It's barely covered at all. Go to LexisNexis, try to check out all the stories on the growth of inequality, the most defining issue for the lifetime experience of every American, even wealthy Americans, but especially the bottom 75% of the population and every young American trying to get a job in this insane economy. And it's just not a news story, barely a news story. Or to the extent it is, it's way after the fact, and it's always in terms that come from on high. And again, this is hugely ironic, going back to the roots of the American Republic. The other great chronicler of freedom of the press in American history was Thomas Jefferson. Jefferson wrote widely, along with Madison. They were close on this issue, and they corresponded on it. Wrote widely about why we needed a press system, why it was integral to the American experiment, there being independent free press. In his most famous essay on it, Jefferson made the point that we need to have a press system or we will go the route of Europe, he said. He said, look at Europe. Europe is a continent that is comprised of wolves and sheep, and the wolves devour the sheep. And for those who didn't quite pick up on where he was getting at, he said the wolves are the wealthy, and the sheep are everyone else. And the only way the United States can prevent that happening and have a genuine democracy is if those people without property can have a press system that gives them the information to govern their lives. Rich people will always get the information they need. Don't worry about them. They're fine. They've figured out how to run society for the last 5,000 years without having anyone have to worry about it. It's everyone else we have to worry about in a democracy. Unless people without property have access to information, the system won't work. That was Jefferson's argument. Very much growing out of Aristotle's work, that if you're going to have genuine democracy, poor people not only have to have the right to participate, they have to rule. Democracy is the rule of the people. It's the rule of poor people, people without property. Well, how does that look in today? How's Tom Jefferson's idea working today? Well, look at America today. Something that's uncovered in our news media, but it's something that's transparent when you look at it, is who votes in America? Who votes in our elections? The Census Bureau divides the American population into 7 groups economically, from richest to poorest, based on income. And they're roughly equal sized. And if you look at what percentage of each of those groups votes in every American election back to 1980, and I've just completed this research, you find that those in the very wealthiest top 7th or 10 or so percent of the population, highest income, 15%, roughly 80% of them, 85% of them vote in presidential elections. Pretty good turnout. And probably 70% in off-year elections, or congressional years, even-numbered years where a president's not being elected. And then you go down to the very poorest Americans, and about 20% of them vote in presidential years, so 21%, and maybe 15% or 17% in off-year elections. And it's a straight line up from there to there, every election back to 1980, as far back as I've gone. There's never an exception. It's never like one year the poor people said, hey, we're going to vote a lot this year, and rich people say, hey, we're going to sit it out. It's a straight line down. Poor people don't vote, rich people do, and you get what we get. Now, in a way, this is a logical reaction to the real world. The research now shows, poor people aren't dumb. They can see what's happening. Rich people aren't dumb. They can see what's happening. The research now shows, the political science research, 3 independent studies in the last 10 years show that members of Congress pay no attention to middle-income and low-income constituents. They just don't. They have no influence whatsoever on policy. The only group that influences policymakers are upper-income constituents. Upper-income constituents. So why vote if you're poor if you have no influence? In fact, ironically, it shows poor people will have a negative effect on their member of Congress. More often than they will have a positive effect. You can see that the member is more likely to ignore them or go the other way, try to hurt them, if anything. So in a way, it's rational. People not vote because they don't get much for it in America. In fact, you could say they get virtually nothing. Now, is this the media's fault? No, not necessarily. It goes much broader factors than that. But journalism's role is not to reinforce that system. Journalism's role is not to make that natural and the way of the world. Journalism's role is to challenge it. Journalism's role is to reverse it, to draw people into public life. Even professional journalism at its lamest is about bringing everyone into public life, not about segregating it out and telling, okay, you're worthless, don't vote, and there's no information for you. Oh, we love you. Here's all you need to know to make more money and vote. That's not professional. That's not journalism. That's propaganda. That's not part of a free society. I don't know if you've ever seen the film Hannah and Her Sisters by Woody Allen. There's a great line in it. Some guy's commenting, and I think if Thomas Jefferson were to return today and see what's going on, he'd never stop throwing up. I mean, this is simply appalling. Now, don't get me wrong. I like professional journalism per se, just not per quo. In the 1930s, professional journalism doesn't have to be the way it is in the United States. That's not like mandated in some sort of DNA that this is the only way you can have professional journalism. In fact, there was an enormous fight over the nature of professional journalism in the United States from 1900 to 1945. It really hit the fan in the 1930s when the Newspaper Guild, the Union of Print Reporters, was established. And the leaders of that union, people like Haywood Broun and George Seldes and the young I.F. Stone, they had a vision of professional journalism. Professional journalism's job was to be adversarial to everyone in power, regardless of the party, on behalf of everyone outside of power. That's the job of professional journalism. And they would have the same standard for everyone in power, regardless of party, and they'd see their jobs actively representing people without property, people without power, and looking out for them, and informing them and drawing them into public life as effective rulers. That was their vision of what a professional journalist should be. Not partisan, but aggressive and democratic. And I won't keep you in suspense. They lost. They didn't win that fight. That vision didn't look great to media owners. They didn't like the idea of ruffling the feathers of their friends. They liked the much more sedate one where you just let people in power set the terms of debate and you report what they say accurately and call that journalism. But, what's interesting about that is if you look today, the great journalists, the ones we all think of, starting with I.F. Stone, they all follow that motto. Jeremy Scahill, Glenn Greenwald. They don't have a different set of criteria for Obama than they had for George W. Bush. A war crime is a war crime. It doesn't matter who commits it, what their party is. The truth is you simply tell the truth and let the chips fall where they may, and you regard all people in power suspiciously. You take any claim they make, especially the more important it is on war, on the economy, you take it you don't take it at face value. You do just the opposite. And that's the type of professional journalism we need to get again. That's the direction we should be pointing toward. Now, the second point I want to make, and this is where I think Emily and I have a somewhat different perspective, and I understand why she's saying what she does. So I think if I were in her shoes, I might say the same thing. But the dismissal of the necessary and foundational role of public money to support journalism in the United States, in my view, and even to internalize that as a virtue, is preposterous. It's unacceptable. Frankly, even if all these new digital ventures take off, and all these businessmen and philanthropists do their level-headed best to make it work, I don't think there's any evidence that will do anything to solve our problem. That will be a piss in the ocean. That will be it just won't happen. I follow all this stuff, and if all of them take off, we're on the 1-yard line with 99 yards to go. It's just a joke. It's nowhere near the loss we've had, and I'll talk about it later, in newsrooms and journalists, and the body of work that's no longer being done. To think that there's some kid working for free in their basement and trying to scramble a micro ad from some local microbrewery is going to somehow replace that? There's no reason to think that. It just doesn't add up. The starting point for understanding the crisis we're in is that journalism is a public good. If you start from the premise that it's a business and the only way you can have journalism if rich people can make money doing it, well, game over. It's not going to happen. It's just not going to happen. It's a public good. And if you want to understand what journalism looks like in the crisis we're in, consider education, something we accept, except for the Republican Party of the United States, but everyone else accepts as a public good. If you removed all public funding for education, or put the same level of funding as we have for journalism, what would education look like? K through 12 education. Well, what you would have is you would have probably really good education for rich people, send their kids to private schools in the first place, so it doesn't really matter. Okay education for middle class people who can somehow scramble ahead. And then you can set loose the entrepreneurs of the world and the philanthropists of the world to do their thing, like we're doing with journalism today. And they cook up some interesting projects and say, hey, Fred Jones in Wichita, hey, he's got 12 kids in his barn. Well, great job, Fred. But that's not going to cut the mustard. What you're going to have is you're going to have a country where half the population's illiterate because there's no money in educating them. It's a public good. That's why you have public support. Well, so is journalism. Journalism's a public good. It means it's something society desperately needs, but they're insufficient resource. The market can't produce it in sufficient quality or quantity. It's that simple. It's a public good. Readers, that fact has been hidden in the last 100 years in the United States by the emergence of advertising. Advertising came to provide between 50 and 80% of the revenues to support journalism, and so it compensated for the fact that it was public good. And it gave us the illusion in the United States that journalism could be commercially solvent. But that advertising was never linked to journalism. It was purely a commercial and opportunistic relationship. Once better options came along, advertisers said, see you later, journalism. Sayonara. And they headed off into the Craigslist and internet sunset. And they've got better deals now. They've got other options. They've got more leverage, and they certainly aren't stuck supporting some lame-ass local monopoly newspaper anymore, or broadcast television or cable TV news channel. They've got other options, generally better options. That money's disappearing, and now we stand in front of journalism. We can see it naked and shriveling in the wind of the market. It is a public good. It will not exist without public support. Advertising won't carry our water for us. And let's not romanticize advertising either, or think it's some purely neutral force. It's always been a mixed blessing. That's one of the reasons we got professional journalism, is because of the corruption advertising had over the content of the news, one of the primary reasons for it. And today what we see when we talk about, well, these young websites can go online, they can get their advertisers and do that sort of stuff. I think if these people have done that, because we're in a situation now where the advertisers have much more leverage than ever. They've got 1,000 choices, not just in journalism, but outside of journalism. If you're trying to get their money, you have much less leverage to go up in negotiated terms to get money. You have the pressure to compromise is much, much greater. I think the idea of advertising being a big part of our journalism in the future, it can be a part, but a big part is nonsensical. It's going to be a small part. It's going to return to the levels it had 150 years ago. And something I keep in mind about online journalism in particular, but also applies to broadcast journalism that I think is lost, is a great saying that I think you should remember. If you get something for free online, you're not the customer, you're the product. If you get something for free online, you're not the customer, you're the product. That's the whole logic. They're giving you something so they can sell you to someone else. That's the only reason they're doing it. And the moment they can't sell you, they're not interested in giving you anything. That's how it works. And that shapes journalism, just like it shapes all content. And it does not, the records show, shape it favorably. It generally shapes it in ways that are not conducive to the values of journalism. Because journalism, I will repeat for the 48th time, is a public good. And public goods need public funding. Now, Emily was correct. At this point, Americans freak out. They wet their pants, they jump up and down, they storm around the room like little kids who want candy. They can't control themselves. The idea of public spending, public subsidies, enough to send people way off the deep end into the ozone layer, freaking out, never to be seen again. Not in America, they say. They smash their fists on the table. It's not in our DNA. This country was founded on not having public subsidies. That's antithetical. Everything this nation stands for, that's antithetical to democracy itself. So we can't even talk about this issue. That door cannot be opened. if we open that door, if we have that discussion, it is inexorable, it is inevitable that soon we'll be looking at nations like Stalin's Russia, Nazi Germany, and Pol Pot's Cambodia. That is the slippery slope that is unavoidable the second you pursue that course. So the door, obviously, who wants to live in Stalin's Russia? Or Pol Pot's Cambodia? So, okay, sorry I raised it. Let's talk about that micro advertiser who's going to bankroll that kid for $50 down the street. That's a better solution. So the door isn't open. The claims are never investigated. They're taken at face value, and they're allowed to sit unchallenged. But they're preposterous. They just simply don't hold up to the slightest bit of scrutiny. They're absolutely ridiculous. The real test, the argument, look, if Stalin increases spending for media, or Hitler, or Pol Pot, of course it'll be propaganda. They're dictators. They're dictatorships. Opposition parties aren't allowed. There's no civil liberties. There's no rule of law. Of course there will. But the real test isn't whether Pol Pot would blow it if he increased funding for public media. The real test is what happens if a democracy does it. And there we actually have a real body of research to look at, like every democratic nation in the world, except the United States. Let's look at what they've done. And maybe that's the relevant pool of data for Americans to look at. The United States, for example, spends $1 billion total on public media. And that includes state governments, local governments, the federal government, and public universities, like mine, that part of their budget goes to support the local NPR and PBS station. $1 billion total in a nation of 310 million people. If the United States spent at the per capita level of any other industrial nation, just on public media, and this doesn't get into other subsidies, like newspaper subsidies and postal, just like for public media, the same per capita rate as other nations, what would it spend? Well, for Canada and Australia, you'd be in the $5 to $8 billion range instead of $1 billion. 5 to 8 billion. For Britain, what, 25 billion roughly? 25 billion. For those of our good friends from Scandinavia, it would be in the 30 to 35 billion dollar range, likewise Germany. So we're spending, these countries are all spending enormous sums, much more on a per capita basis, subsidizing just public media, not to mention other things. Now, the question I think you have to ask in America, and this is the question no American wants to talk about, are these countries police states? Are they hellholes? Have they lost all sense of freedom? Are these terrible places to live? And some of them may well be. I don't want to pass judgment.
Please.
But, I have been to Norway quite a bit, probably 15 times in the last 25 years, for extensive stays all over the country, sometimes going native, pretending to be Norwegian. So they haven't, covered their act while I was there to try to pretend, show me the Potemkin village. And I don't think I've ever seen a policeman in Norway except in downtown Oslo. I haven't heard anyone getting hauled out of their house in the middle of the night because they have newspaper subsidies or public subsidies. And so, it looks actually, these guys have figured out a way you can do it. And, it's a solvable problem. They can do it. And there's lots of evidence about this. And I think the evidence is overwhelming. The Economist magazine, which I'm sure you're all familiar with, not known as a left-wing journal. I wasn't asked to co-edit that, like Monthly Review. The Economist magazine rates all the nations of the world every year in something it calls its Democracy Index. And it uses traditional political science criteria about voter turnout, lack of corruption, political parties, all the stuff you'd expect to judge whether a country's democratic politically. And guess what? Guess what? The top 5 or 6 countries on their list every year are the top 5 or 6 subsidizers of press in the world, always. The United States is way down the list, way down the list. So those countries which have the largest subsidies to journalism are the countries considered the most democratic by The Economist magazine, mind you. The Economist, a neoliberal publication, which has many great attributes. I'm a subscriber, but it certainly would not be confused with a socialist publication. But then there's another group that's also rated all the press systems of the world, does it annually, called Freedom House, based in the United States. It was formed in the Cold War, and its job is to monitor government oppression, primarily, of commercial news media around the world. It rates all the countries in the world and how free their press systems are. And it actually is a very sophisticated system. They look at commercial factors. They look at a lot of stuff. It's not just how free they are, but how credible they are, too, how strong they are. They want to see if you actually have a strong press system. Freedom House, not a left-wing group, funded apparently by the CIA. To take that, no, eliminate that. Rumored to have been received funding from U.S. government institutions at points in its history. Just rumored. Who does it put as its freest press systems in the world? Same thing. It puts the countries with the largest press subsidies, government subsidies of journalism, are the freest press systems in the world, with the least amount of censorship of private media in the world and public media come from these countries. They're the freest press systems, they're the ones at the top of the list of the freest press systems. The United States was 23rd last year, according to Freedom House, because of all the cutbacks. It's been so decimated, there's no journalism left. We're down to 23rd. We're not even in the top 20, according to Freedom House, which is a US-based group. So I think the evidence is pretty clear. Private media can prosper in countries with subsidies. In fact, I think it's pretty clear they do better in countries with ample subsidies, because there's a whole base of people who consume journalism, who get part of the culture, it's part of the system. And moreover, what some of the research has now come to show is that increasing subsidies can lead to more aggressive press towards the government, not more compliant press. In a democracy, it's the opposite of what would happen in Cambodia or Stalin's Russia. More press subsidies can lead to more adversarial coverage of the government. My point here is not that these countries have perfect media by any stretch. In fact, the last day in this country has absolved me of any belief in that regard. But that these are solvable problems. Subsidies can work. Some can work better than others, but these are solutions that we have before us if we want them. America needs its subsidies too, much better than we currently have. For starters, we need to vastly increase money for both public and community broadcasting. The community system is very different than public. We need competing independent newsrooms in each community, competing independent newsrooms that are well funded with journalists covering them. We also need to have some sort of system, like we have a program called Teach for America to take young people out of college and give them money, pay them to teach in inner city schools for a year or two out of college, to give them work and to solve a great social problem. Let's have a right for America. Let's take 20,000 kids out of college and give them money to go be journalists for a year or two and just start doing it. Just create the stuff and assign them to media, figure out a system. But we've got to really get in there. We're about to lose a generation of kids, of young people, I'm old enough to say kids, of young people who are not going to have an opportunity to do journalism. And it is simply unacceptable. It's simply not acceptable. We can't afford to do that. It's like having a generation of people who aren't going to train to read and write. It's just not something a free society can do. But we need to work at it. We need lots of study, experimentation, and debate, but it's a solvable problem. And then here's the real kicker. Here's the real kicker. And I think some of you know the answer to this, probably are getting at it. We'll get the question. Guess what democratic nation in human history pioneered the use of massive government subsidies to create a viable press system? Guess what nation made a singular contribution to the human race to say huge government subsidies to journalism are mandatory to have a free society and self-governing system?
We read the book.
You read the book. See, I knew you'd know. You were supposed to say Belarusia. I told you ahead of time, you forgot. Now, yeah, the United States, America, good old Uncle Sam. So much for this crap about it being in our bone marrow that we can't have subsidies of journalism in America. Quite the opposite. The United States government, for the first 100 years of its history, starting at the very beginning, instituted colossal printing and postal subsidies to spawn an independent press system. The most important institution in this regard is our post office, which is the largest federal agency by far. Over 80% of government employees deep into the 19th century were at the post office. And the post office was basically the distribution arm of every American newspaper into the 1830s and most American newspapers and all weeklies, but through the end of the century. And so it was, you know, if you had a newspaper, the post office was how you distributed it. And so what they charged you for postage would determine whether you could be in business. It was going to be the single largest charge you faced was your distribution charge, or among your largest charges. And the post office would come to, the debate in Congress, starting in 1792, and they passed the first Post Office Act, and the debate would be every year is, what are we going to charge newspapers compared to other mail, and whether we should subsidize it. And the range of debate was between those on one side that said it to be extremely heavily subsidized. So if a first-class letter cost, for example, which is actually, I'm giving you real numbers, 24 cents back then. A newspaper, which is much bigger and heavier, should cost 1 cent to be mailed. So the heavy subsidy of newspapers. That was one extreme position, heavy subsidy. The other extreme position, that of James Madison and Benjamin Franklin and Thomas Jefferson, was that all newspapers at all times should always be sent for free. Should be complete government subsidy for newspapers wherever they're sent anywhere in the country. That came to be George Washington's position by the end of his presidency, too. And Madison's argument was very clear. He said, any charge of postage for newspapers, the first papers that will go out of business will be the most marginal, the most dissident. And those are exactly the newspapers a free society needs to keep alive. We need to have any charge, he said, it become an invidious form of censorship against dissonant ideas. So Madison said total subsidy, so we encourage as many newspapers as possible. Now these guys won. There was just a heavy subsidy, not completely free. They won, though, largely because they were afraid that you'd wipe out local newspapers if national papers could go for free everywhere. They wanted to give some spur for local newspapers to survive from national competition. But it was a massive subsidy. So throughout the 19th century, the post office accounted for 95% of all the weighted traffic of the post office, 70% of the units sent. 70%, that's what the post office did. But it only accounted for 10% of the post office revenues. 10% of the revenues, a massive subsidy. So important was this issue to Madison and Jefferson, they went to George Washington and implored him to make Thomas Paine the first Postmaster General of the United States. Say, let's send the message to the country how we view this issue. Thomas Paine couldn't get appointed to a government job today. You know, Washington sort of checked out what he'd written about religion and said, I'm not ready for this guy yet. I don't think he's going to get through Congress. We'll give him a pass. But that's how important they thought this issue was. We went back to try to figure out how big was this subsidy? How big was the subsidy of the U.S. government? And fortunately for us, Congress commissioned the Postal Department, the Post Office, to do a thorough study of its economics in the 1840s. And we looked at the original data and determined the size of the subsidy. And then we took that subsidy plus the printing subsidy, and we looked at that data, too, from the printing contracts that had subsidies for newspapers. And we determined that if the United States today had the same percent of its GDP went to newspaper and journalism subsidies as it did in the 1840s, we'd have to spend $35 billion today. That's how significant of an expense it was then. Now, you might be noticing a funny coincidence here. That $35 billion figure, that sort of seems to be the democratic price of having a free press, if you look around the world and look historically. Now, I agree with what Emily said. I don't think we have to spend that sort of money today. I do think digital technologies dramatically lower crucial cost, so we can get great journalism for a lot less than $35 billion. But it doesn't replace labor cost. People can't eat their computer cord. You know, they can't sleep in the streets and do it. You have to pay labor. You get what you pay for. There's no way around it. It's the single most important expense for journalism. And you need institutions to protect journalists. Journalists can't go out and freelance it. It's done in a cooperative institutional environment. When Tocqueville came to the United States in the 1830s, he was astounded at how many newspapers there were. Newspapers everywhere, probably 10 times as many as in France per capita or England or Canada. Just amazed if you read his book. Several references, discussions of newspapers. And he said in America, no one gets rich publishing newspapers. They come and go, but every town, no matter how small, has several of them. He said newspapers, the more newspapers there are, he said, in a society, the more equal it is and the more democratic it is. That wasn't an accident. And the United States in that period was the most, in the northern states, was the most egalitarian it's been in terms of income distribution in its history in the 1830s. That wasn't an accident. That was brilliant, brilliant policy making that produced that situation. And then we can do it again. There's no reason we can't. It'll be different policies, but it'll be tough. But it's solvable. Now, the fight in America has been tough because it's just such a knee-jerk argument against it. But people are coming around. The evidence is clear. I mean, that's why I was a little bit taken back with some of the comments yesterday, because most working journalists today look around and they see what's going on, and they see that, you know, there's no option. This is the only way forward. This is how you do it. This is the proven path. The question is how good your policies are going to be. Are they going to be effective? Are they going to work? Are they going to maintain independence and competition and quality? That's the debate we should be having. How do you do it? Not whether you do it or whether you should even think about doing it. How you do it, how you make it work. And then the third point I'll make, in the concluding part of this lecture, is that the crisis of journalism is not an abstract crisis happening on itself. It's part of the deep and growing crisis in the United States of American democracy, and I suspect in other countries as well, part of their crises as well. But in the United States, it's clear. Our economy is now in the worst condition it's been in since the 1930s. And even the most optimistic people in the business community, in their private writings, in the business press, acknowledge that the best outcome for the American economy for the next generation will be worse than anything we've seen since the 1930s. It will be probably, at best, what Japan got in the 1990s. At best, it will be stagnation with 1 or 2% growth and not too much, income dropping much below 9 or 10%. That's our best case scenario right now for where we're going. Best case scenario. Those are the optimists on Wall Street and the advisors, this Larry Summers. And these guys their batting average isn't real high recently, so I wouldn't bet that we're going to go that route. But this is the world we're entering now. It's a very different world than the one we've come from for my lifetime, or anyone in this room who's over the age of 30 or 35. A very different world. We're looking at ecological crises, too, that we like to think, oh, we can slough them off till our grandchildren come along, and we're just, sorry, kids. But unfortunately, who is it with the great saying, the bumper sticker in America goes, this is, for Americans, we get this reference, nature bats last. And, nature's sort of up to the plate right now, it looks like. It's not waiting till our grandchildren show up to step up to the plate. And worst of all in America, and most importantly, our political system is completely off the rails. The term that I use for it in the new book I'm writing with my buddy John Nichols is dollarocracy. The corruption of our governing system is so extreme now, we're finally rivaling levels of the Gilded Age of the robber barons of the late 19th century. We have a situation in the United States today, which is very interesting. And this is the best way to understand the crisis we faced. Public opinion in the United States hasn't changed that much on core governing issues, Social Security, military spending, the economy, whether you should have unions. Has not changed that much since the 1970s, maybe slightly, but it's pretty much, you just ask about issues and what people want and believe. Public opinion's been pretty stable. What's happened in the last 30 years is the two political parties have moved way over here. So what they're talking about is way different than what sort of, you just ask people independent of what these guys are doing, what you think. Completely different. There's a huge gap there that exists. And this is driven by money. And there's other factors too, but it's primarily driven that these guys are both basically dominated and controlled by large money interests. And it's the crisis of our times. And right now it looks impervious to reform. The Republican Party of the United States today is extreme beyond all belief. There's nothing been like it in American history. They want to return to the era Dickens wrote about. And I say that they want to get rid of public education. They want to, basically reify a class society that really predates the last 75 or 100 years of American history. The difference, of course, is that back in the time of Dickens, the United Kingdom was a country on the way up with a future. The United States right now looks like a country only with a past. The corporate crowd is very happy with the journalism-free environment. The people over here, these parties, perfectly happy with the fact that there's no one reporting on them. They're not complaining about it. Mitch McConnell is not standing up on the floor of the U.S. Senate saying, gee whiz, I wish someone would investigate these companies we're dealing with or we're handing out these big contracts. He's not saying, come on, guys, over here. Come on, look at what I'm doing. He's not doing that. He's perfectly happy with the journalism-free environment, and that's exactly what he has. And, of course, their pit bulls on the political right oppose any and all efforts for reform. They're even trying to eliminate public broadcasting, and they've done a pretty good job of getting it to the point where, as bad as it was, or as ineffectual as it's been, it's even in a more precarious position today. The media diet of most Americans today is appalling. The news media diet. The balance is probably true too, but I will leave that out. There's been a complete disintegration and collapse of coverage of government, corporate relations at all levels, especially at the state and local level. Even in the federal level is bad too, but at the local level, it's just simply mind-boggling what's happened. This has led to tremendous downward pressure on wages, something, again, I think that can't be exaggerated. When you've got thousands and thousands and tens of thousands of journalists out of work, far fewer jobs, the way the market works is those who have jobs don't get raises because if they bellyache, there are 10 people lining up who'd be glad to take their job. And that's what's happening now. It also means the working conditions for paid journalists, that shrinking crew, are much worse. There's much more pressure on them to produce more for obvious reasons. If they don't like it, there's 50 people standing at the factory door gates willing to come in. And the term I think that's widely used among journalists is that we're seeing an era of the digital sweatshop. This is what's logically happening. You're working for Yahoo News or Huffington Post. It's not like some glory days. This isn't some great, wonderful period. This is the West Sweatshop era. You're not getting paid, you're getting paid very little, and you have no control over your environment, or very little. It's a dreadful situation. Now, I'll give you a sense of just how severe the crisis is. A couple personal anecdotes, then some data. The three biggest political scandals in the United States in the last decade in Washington involved a lobbyist named Jack Abramoff, who did all sorts of sleazy stuff, buying off politicians and bribing people. A politician named Tom DeLay, who was connected to Abramoff and did all sorts of sleazy stuff accepting those bribes. And a leading leader of the House of Representatives of the Republican Party is the whip, which is the second highest position in the party, in the House. And then a guy named Randy Duke Cunningham, an obscure member of Congress, but who took bribes from a military contractor. All three of these members, these figures, were brought down and arrested and went to jail. What led to their arrest and led to their scandals was three reporters from daily newspapers broke stories about them, and then prosecutors saw the stories and said, yeah, we got to do something about this. They went out and they led to the prosecution, and these three guys, their careers were over, although Tom DeLay did go on Dancing with the Stars in America, and he was better at that than he was at politics. I can say that. But the point is, those three reporters are all unemployed now. Those three jobs no longer exist. Those three people who broke those stories don't exist anymore and getting paid jobs. So the Tom DeLays and Jack Abramoffs and Randy Duke Cunninghams today in Washington and going forward, they can sleep a lot easier at night. There's probably not one going to catch up what they're up to. They simply aren't going to be covered. They'll say, well, there's some volunteer dude who's going to do that one. That doesn't work that way. Volunteer dudes don't do that. If I'm not getting paid, I'm going to cover the basketball game. I'm not going to spend months and months digging into some fruitless thing. You got to pay me to do that stuff. That's why it's a paid profession. You got to get good people, not some volunteer. It could be some whack job, some psycho case. You want to trust our journalism to lunatics? No, we want people who are accountable, not self-appointed journalists. Don't know their heads from their butts. And I'll give one other personal story that it was really striking because it happened to a friend of mine. And I can't mention names, especially since you're already having trouble with what I've done said also, which always happens to me. A friend of mine is the manager of county services in a county in America. And in the United States, the way it works is county government's primary job is doing social services for their counties. And in rural areas in particular, this is very important because there's a lot of unincorporated part of the county, so they have huge business. And this friend of mine is the head of social services for a county in a fairly populous but still rural state in Appalachia. And it employs over 200 people. She has immense amounts of work, especially, I said she, I was trying to keep my cover going.
Yeah.
Okay,
She, he.
It. She. And so she's got over 200 employees, a huge budget, and they deal with people. Well, in her town, which is the county seat of this county, someone in her office screwed up, and one of the people they take care of died. And they basically killed someone. And when this news broke out inside the office, I said, shit, we killed someone? We haven't done that one before. And I said, God, this could be, certainly lots of people lose their jobs. Maybe some people are going to go to jail. The budget might get cut. It's going to be a huge scandal. There's going to be all sorts of people raising hell about this. And they were all really scared to death. And then a couple of weeks get by and nothing happened. Yeah, this is interesting. And then like a couple more weeks went by and then no one knew anything. No one was talking about it. Just only the people inside that office knew anything about it. And after about 2 months, they said, hey, you know what? No one's ever going to find out about this. We just got away with murder. Interesting. We got away with murder. And why was that? Well, they actually had an award-winning, one of the top regional newspapers in America was based in that county, headquartered in the county seat, and it had 22 reporters in 2007. And by the time this took place in 2009, they were down to 4 reporters. 4 reporters. They'd lost 18 of their reporters. They were down to 4 reporters who had to cover everything. They had to fill the news hole, 4 of them. And just, they just shouldn't. It wouldn't matter if I.F. Stone had come back from his grave and his DNA had been used for these 4 reporters. It just would have missed it. It's only so much humans can do. And that's what happened. So now they know. So they go about their business, just like Tom DeLay and Jack Abramoff and Mitch McConnell and all that crowd knows. They pretty much can do whatever they want. And in this environment, a journalism-free environment, it's clear sailing ahead. There's been some more stronger, broader data we should talk about. The Pew Center, a research group in the United States funded by the Pew Foundation, has been doing research on Baltimore, Maryland's news for the past 25 years or so. And they did a major report and update. Some of you might have seen it. I hope you have. If you haven't, it's in the book, the paperback version, because it came out after we did the first version. And they looked at all the news generated in Baltimore, Maryland. Baltimore is a city of metropolitan area, probably 2 million people. It's one of our major cities. It's got major league sports teams and the like, so it's not a small town. It's probably, I guess, the equivalent of like a Manchester or Birmingham here in England. And what they did is they wanted to see how many original news stories, not just people picking up other stuff on the internet and reposting it, but how many original news stories actually required someone doing something that hadn't been done by someone else, were being done in Baltimore. And this is something they've been keeping tabs of now for 25 years, which is why it's important. And what they found out is the amount of original stories being done in Baltimore, and they were very generous in what they looked at. Anything online counted, tweets, they looked at everything. The number of original news stories being produced in Baltimore by journalists is down 30% since 2000. 30% decline in original news stories. And it's down 70% since 1991. 70% decline in original news stories since 1991. In our experience traveling around the country, John Nichols and I doing our book talk for Death and Life of American Journalism in 2010, we go into every newspaper newsroom, and every time we go to talk to journalists. John is a working journalist, editor of daily newspaper. So we have entree to every newsroom. And they all basically said the same thing, that this is pretty accurate, that most of them are down to about half of the size they were at their peak in the late 80s or early 90s. Most newsrooms, and they're shrinking. I mean, those are all bigger than they are today in every case. So that seemed pretty accurate. But, you know, to a lot of Americans, this isn't really clear. Your newspapers are getting smaller, but it seems still there's plenty of news. There are TV news channels everywhere. There's websites everywhere. And we're going to always have plenty of news. We just aren't going to have much journalism. And there's a big difference. And here the Pew study is informative, too. The Pew study did something else that's really interesting. They looked at all the original news stories in Baltimore, and they said, why is this a news story? What is the reason this is in the news? What accounts for why this is covered and not something else? What made this? Why did this show up here? And they found out that 86% of the original news stories in Baltimore came either directly from press releases or from some official statement of someone in power. And in most, if not all cases, there was almost no journalism sort of to fact check it, change it, do anything with it. It was just pretty much straight regurgitation in 86% of the cases. 14% were driven by reporters, editors saying, let's go cover this, what's happening here, and driving the story. 86% came from official sources or public relations. Now, to give some sense of history, most research shows that at the high point of professional journalism in the United States, the early 70s, late 60s, that era, the best newspapers in America, like the New York Times or Washington Post, probably had 40, maybe at the outside 50% of stories that could be attributed this way. That's been a big part of professional journalism, always. PR and official sources play a big role. But it's grown because it's cheap to do. It's real cheap to do. It's real easy to do that and call it news. We're seeing just a huge increase in spin, for lack of a better term. And some of the research we did in Death and Life of American Journalism, we went and we looked at Census and Bureau of Labor Statistics data to try to compute the ratio of the number of public relations people to working journalists in the United States over the last 50 years. Public relations people, their job, if they're good at it, and the great thing about public relations is that unlike advertising, you know, we can all talk about the 10 greatest ad campaigns of all time and have a belly laugh and, oh yeah, that aspirin ad or that car ad. They want you to know about it. They want you to remember it. None of us can talk about the 10 greatest PR campaigns of all time. Because we know about it, it wasn't a great campaign. The whole idea of great PR is it's surreptitious. Their job is to make you think it's just natural that the press is suddenly covering this or has this viewpoint's natural. Well, so PR people, they're lobbyists. They do a lot of stuff. They try to influence public opinion. But a crucial part of their function is to try to influence the news surreptitiously. So stories are presented, and they look like they're the judgment of legitimate journalists in newsrooms, not their flunky stories that are just paid for or promoted by private interests, be they government or commercial. So in 1960, the ratio of public relations people to working journalists was roughly 1-to-1. For every working journalist in America, there was one PR person. By 1980, the ratio was roughly 2-to-1, close to it. 2 PR people for every working journalist. Today, the ratio is 4-to-1. There's 4 PR people for every working journalist. So basically, 86%, 4-1. You're sort of getting a sense of where we're at and where journalism is heading. We're going to have lots of journalism, lots of news, but it's going to be largely propaganda and spin and fluff and nonsense. Inexpensive, easy to stuff cover, the sort of stuff that dominates our news today. And in America, and a point that can't be really exaggerated and hasn't come up yet, the diet for most Americans, a significant percentage, is going to be, especially if you drive in your car and listen to the radio, is going to be extraordinary right-wing propaganda. Much of it well to the right, even of what we have on our Fox News channel. That is what people are exposed to. And as one who drives across rural America 30 times a year at great lengths listening to this, it's something, it's sort of like hardcore pornography. Unless you see it, you don't really know what you're talking about. Unless you listen to this radio, you really don't know what Americans are listening to, and it's a very different world than the world academics are familiar with. And it's extraordinary right-wing, and it thrives on a lack of journalism because the claims are so absurd and outlandish, only someone who knows nothing about what's actually happening in the world can hold to this. And so it benefits by a journalism-free environment. In this environment, again, not to be too repetitive, just doing nothing isn't an option. Just hoping that we get lucky and that we break the tide of history and find out it is a private good and that private interests are going to give us all the great journalism we need is nonsense. But even if it was true, even if, yeah, we can make a case that at some point private interests are going to come up with a way to make money providing great popular journalism so people can govern their lives. If we want to make that case, we don't have the luxury to wait 20 or 30 years for that to happen. It's not like we're getting a 20 or 30-year period where we can just sort of time out on history. Nothing's going to happen for the next 30 years until these guys figure it out. We need journalism now. I mean, we're going through crises now that we need journalism right away. We don't have that luxury, and we need to figure out the answers right now. We always talk in my field, and I think at this conference and among all journalism scholars, we always make the strong case about how democracy needs journalism, and that's true. You can't, that's everything I've said today is about how you can't have effective self-government or free society without journalism. But you flip it around, the other side of it's true too. You can't have journalism without democracy. And that's something I think journalists and people oftentimes forget. You can't have journalism without democracy. Journalism is not agnostic about whether it's in a democratic society or a fascist dictatorship. It has a stake in the outcome. It cannot survive unless it survives and thrives and exists only in a democratic society, or at its best in a democratic society. Therefore, the future of journalism is very much tied up with movements for democracy. They rise and they fall together. That's the only way we're going to come up with the sort of solutions I'm talking about in the United States. They aren't going to handle abstractly as Mitch McConnell and the Democrats get together and say, oh yes, I guess we do need some journalism. Good idea. Cheerio. Here's $10 billion for public broadcasting. That's not going to work that way. The only way we're getting reforms in the United States is through a popular movement that makes it part of a broader democratization of our society. It takes the money out of politics, that forcefully addresses the collapse of living standards and the disintegration of our infrastructure. It's going to be part of a broader popular movement. The type of thing that happens once a generation or every 2 generations in the United States, but this is a much greater magnitude. It's really more of a once-in-a-century movement that we're going to need. At this point, late in my talk, people finally say, okay, this guy really is nuts. This guy is really deluded. How can anyone even talk like that? How can anyone talk about that sort of change? Even if he's right, doesn't he understand it's hopeless? There's no hope of changing anything. And I confess I am an optimist by nature, because I think pessimism is self-fulfilling. And I think if you act like social change for the better is impossible, you guarantee it'll be impossible. That's the one thing we control, is our outlook and what we can do. And that's not something, that's a path I refuse to ever go down. But it's more than that. I think the evidence is clear that we are in a very different political moment in the United States than we've been in due to the severity of the crisis I've described. And I suspect, looking at the coverage of what's happening around the world, most other nations are in a similar space, although each country has its own specifics. I think oftentimes scholars, people in general, when they think about politics, they're to use the old expression, they're fighting last year's war. We always think about politics now and going forward in terms of our most immediate memories, what just has happened. And what I'm going to tell you is I don't think that works anymore. I think we're in the critical juncture, as someone talked about yesterday and as I've written about. We're in a period of severe crisis where everything we know is of less value. We're entering terra incognita now. We're entering a political period that's not going to, just can't use the playbook from 2003 or 1987. We've got to draw up some new plays. And I saw that firsthand in Madison, Wisconsin, where I live this past winter, where I had the privilege of being a backbencher and participating in the demonstrations of the people of Wisconsin against the cutbacks in the ban on unions being proposed by the governor and the Republican state legislature. And literally tens of thousands of people coming out almost on a daily basis. Some days, 150,000 people coming out in the most extraordinary peaceful protests I've seen. At the end of the day, there was less rubbish on the ground than there had been at the beginning of the day. I mean, this was the most mellow, heterogeneous, extraordinary group of people. It reaffirmed one's faith, or in some cases affirmed it for the first time in our country and our people like nothing else. And it was an extraordinary uprising because not just the size and the nature and quality, but it was driven entirely at the grassroots. The labor movement, the Democratic Party had nothing to do with it. They were deep in the caboose trying to figure out what was going on. It was an extraordinary development. And I think there on display was the future of America, if there is one. If we're going to get out of the crisis we have of this corruption and downward spiral, it's going to come there. And I think that's where we need to look for the next great era of journalism and democracy. Thank you.